Welcome to For the Record, where we provide deeper insights into articles from Atlantic Business Magazine.
Welcome. We've got a bit of a different episode for you this time around. I'm Ashley Fitzpatrick. I'm a staff writer with the magazine, and I've sort of taken over the shop here along with some fellow journalists, Philip Moscovitch, who's based in Nova Scotia, and Kevin Yarr in Prince Edward Island. Thank you both for being here with me to talk about our stories that we've written for this issue.
Good to be here.
Thanks.
So we've all written about Atlantic Canada's power systems, and that's, sort of a really interesting idea to see how some of these stories are crossing over. The issue itself has a cover that talks about power systems coming to the brink. So I thought it would be a really good idea to just come together and talk a little bit about that in particular. Now, Philip, you did a story that looked at SMR, small modular reactors, that idea of nuclear power being a part of the base power for the systems and how it would work with renewable energy. But what did you find in terms of coming across this idea of being at the brink or coming to potential crises?
So, I don't think anyone's thinking here that there's an immediate crisis, but obviously, with power, you've got to plan several years out. So, the origin of my story was seeing that Nova Scotia had signed a memorandum of understanding with Ontario on small modular reactors. This was also coming at a time when the provincial government had lifted a longstanding moratorium on uranium mining. And so I was wondering, does this memorandum of understanding mean that Nova Scotia is interested in getting into nuclear power production? We do have, a couple of deadlines coming up in the province. So in 2030, all of our power production is supposed to be off coal, and 80% of it is supposed to be coming from clean energy. So that's going to represent a challenge. And we can see, for instance, this winter, there was a particularly cold snap. There were some issues with Muskrat Falls. I think Newfoundland had issues with fears about being able to supply enough of its own power. And we were told potentially in Nova Scotia we would have to conserve. So we do have all these interrelated kind of issues, which hopefully won't push us to the brink. But I think that's something people are obviously worried about.
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing happening in a silo in this region, which I think is probably one of the more interesting pieces. Kevin, I know for you, you're looking at Prince Edward Island, and that's always been, that connection with New Brunswick has been so key to their energy system. And you talked a little bit about the idea of building up more independence within the PEI system. But what do you feel in terms of that suggestion of, we've had these systems coming to the brink, or that there's a real risk there? How did you find that?
There is a real risk here on Prince Edward Island that we're getting pretty close to. Maritime Electric, which is the main supplier, actually supplies all of the province with the exception of the city of Summerside, said in the fall, we could have rolling blackouts this winter. As it turned out, we didn't. We got a little lucky, maybe. The big issue is really cold weather and people running their heat pumps and then pushing the capacity of the grid to the edge. And we were lucky that we had a little wind blowing at the time when it was really cold. So that kind of kept things going. But basically, we're in a situation on PEI right now. If we have a really cold night and the wind is not blowing, there's probably not going to be enough electricity to go around.
Yeah, there was always this suggestion, I think, that, in Atlantic Canada, well, you had these interconnections. So if things really came up onto it, then you would have the ability to import power, that there would be no issues. And I think all of the utilities now are sort of recognizing with the increased demand for electricity that, these decisions that they maybe had a little more time for in their minds are becoming a little more necessary now, or have a more immediate effect. I know I wrote a couple of pieces. One was looking mainly at New Brunswick and what's happening there with NB Power, both making decisions essential to keep the energy system running, regardless of its wonderful interconnections that are there. it's got issues with its own system, and then it's also under a review with the New Brunswick government to determine even the future of the utility in and of itself. So there's some really important kind of pieces that are all coming together at once right now for New Brunswick. And then in a separate piece, we were looking at Newfoundland and Labrador and what's happening with the Churchill River MOU. In that case, it's more of a question of the province's financial future because it's so intertwined with what's happening with the utility system. But at the same time, until that's decided, until this moment of hiatus is through, they're not really going to be able to move forward with, more important discussions of energy planning and what's actually going to be serving the province at what costs going forward. And I think that that's one of the really curious things is, we have all these clear risks and also demands for more immediate decisions, but a lot of people wondering about, okay, looking ahead, are we sure that these systems are going to meet our needs and are they going to come in at the costs that we can afford, essentially? So I'm wondering about, I'll go to Philip first, what about that forward view? So, when you're looking ahead from what you've learned or what you've been looking at, what are you thinking about and maybe what are you looking for?
Well, there's some changes in the electricity system in Nova Scotia in that we have a new independent energy system operator, which is a new nonprofit independent body tasked with procuring electricity for the system and taking care of the sort of Nova Scotia Power will still, you know, operate the distribution grid, but the IESO is going to make the decisions on where the power is coming from. So, the Conservative government is very big on its proposed Wind West project, which will be, a very large offshore wind farm. But that's theoretical at the moment, and it'll take years and years until it's producing any power. In the meantime, the IESO has signed an agreement with New Brunswick for power from their new power plant, I believe, in is it in Tantramar? And there's plans to build a couple of new gas
Yes, that's
plants
it. Sorry.
here. Yeah, okay. So, uh, you know, so, so you get this, paradoxical situation of, all right, are the methane plants really necessary to have that baseload power? They're really expensive. We also have some pilot projects with large community battery storage. And so a lot of advocates are saying, well, we need more of those, and if we can have more of those, maybe we can avoid some of these other large expenses. And and in terms of the small modular reactors, I mean, nobody's talking about building any nuclear reactors in Nova Scotia right now. But what I was told by someone in the department was that they want to ease kind of any regulatory barriers. So if the IESO decides at one point that that's the direction they want to go, it'll be easier for them. And I guess what they're looking at, they are taking a wait and see. What they're looking at is, Ontario's building a couple of these nuclear power plants, but they cost billions of dollars, and they're not cheap. They're essentially scaled down versions of the Fukushima reactor with some added safety features. And there's a lot of hype about small modular reactors, but a lot of it is like very theoretical. Like we're not getting into the like there's a little mini reactor in every subdivision anytime soon. That, but so essentially, I think the reason the ones that are being built in Darlington that people are looking at is that they're using a proven technology already. It's just somewhat smaller, so you can produce 300 megawatts instead of 700 or more.
Yeah, and I find the interesting thing too is that, you have this massive proposal or concept that's happening with Wind West and just how much energy would be supplied there. And it's not really clear yet, I don't think, of how much of that could potentially be used domestically versus purely for export, which seems to be the core discussion that's happening there right now. And then you at the same time have the options or discussion that's happening around this nuclear power option. And it seems like there's so much that's going to be dependent on, who's coming forward and who's actually proposing projects, as opposed to just talking about, I suppose, the concepts or generally what we could do, because there are so many options, it feels like, from reading what you had there.
I think when we talk about the future, we need to understand what it is that's required. It's not so much a shortage of energy as a shortage of power, and that peak demand. And right now on Prince Edward Island, most of the electricity is just coming under the strait from New Brunswick, and that's fine on your average day. And then that can be supplemented by renewables as the wind blows and the sun shines here. Where we run into trouble is when we hit those peak demand days, cold days, typically cold days in the winter. Is there enough actual power in the moment for everybody? And since you can't always rely on renewables, what the utilities here on Prince Edward Island are saying is we need to have basically diesel. That's really the option they're looking at here for backup. That doesn't mean that you're going to be burning it all the time. They've got 15 megawatts capacity in Summerside. That with their peak load of 35, so that's almost half of what they need. They can generate locally using diesel, which sounds like a lot, but when you actually look at 2025, only about 1/3% of the actual energy that was used over the course of the year came from those diesel generators, because they don't operate very often, but they do operate when you need them, and that means the lights don't go off. So you're putting yourself in this situation where you've got a choice. You can either just straight up build diesel, when we're talking about Prince Edward Island, and just say, well, we're just going to keep doing that. Or you can build renewables and diesel so that you have the diesel to back up when the renewables aren't functioning. Or the third option is you can just say, well, we're going to have rolling blackouts sometimes. And I
Yeah,
don't think
I think
that's an
the
option
utilities would
that
say that's
anyone's
not an
going to go
option.
for.
Yeah.
But that's sort of your other option. And the other thing actually that's interesting, and Philip mentioned this, is the battery backup, which Summerside has begun experimenting with. That's another what they call dispatchable resource, meaning that you can basically fire it up right away. And so that's another option versus diesel, but that hasn't been done on a large scale yet here.
Yeah, and it seems like everyone's kind of waiting to see, in particular, I think, where the utility review boards, so where the regulators come in terms of maybe pushing for options that, I guess, how far they go in terms of the environmental piece on this, right? So when you cost out your options, the public is starting to express a lot of interest in seeing more renewables and seeing the renewable battery options. But how far on sort of the technical end and the review end are they going to come in and go in terms of insisting that those are there, or maybe even denying the more traditional option, which would be your thermal systems. But I think that one of the things I'm looking to the future on PEI, and in your piece you had mentioned they've got their 10-year energy plan. So is there something in particular for PEI where you're thinking, okay, this is coming up, and I feel like this is going to give us a sense of where things are going to go into the future?
That energy plan is pretty thin on specifics. It talks about having a lot of different options in the basket, but it doesn't really say what those options might be. Just that it's a good idea to have a lot of options. So that's still something that's got to be worked out. I think that part of the debate is a misunderstanding, maybe to a degree, about what's necessary. That uh, people see a big fossil plant going up and saying, "Why are we building this? Why don't we invest in renewables?" And they don't see how the two go hand in hand if you're actually going to keep the lights on. The other option, of course, if you're really going to go, if you want to avoid fossil fuels is the battery storage, as I mentioned, but how big a scale can we go on that? How quickly can we do that? I don't know if anyone's actually seriously talking about that yet on a large scale.
Yeah, and it seems like reliability is really core to a lot of the discussions that are happening right now. People want to be sure that the lights come on, a lot like is highlighted on the cover of this issue of the magazine. And in particular, when you're talking about the effect on businesses, if you're a small business owner, that you have to keep your freezers going, or else you're going to lose all of your product. The idea of outages or rolling outages is completely outside of what you can accept, I think.
It's a huge thing here for seafood processors in particular, who can have tens of millions of dollars worth of product in storage at any given time. So, yeah, a reliable source of electricity is central to that industry.
Yeah. There's just no doing without it. And I think that's, for companies across the region, but especially when you're talking about something like a seafood producer, I mean, that's a perfect example and so essential to the economy overall. You can't
It's
can't ignore it.
inconvenient. It's inconvenient in your house, but
Yeah,
it can be
exactly.
catastrophic for a business.
In your business, yeah, for sure. The other thing I wanted to just bring up is that idea of integration, because if you do have a situation where you're being pulled to the brink, quote unquote, it is always fantastic when you have those interconnections, and more importantly, the power that's available in other areas, hopefully, that you can rely on. But I know, Philip, there's not some, there's been quite a bit of work done in terms of interconnections, in particular between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and talking more about those interties. Of course, an issue for PEI as well, but in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and that idea of sort of leaning on each other. What have you seen on that?
Yeah, well, there is an advocate, an energy policy analyst I spoke to for the story who, was thought that was really one of the ways to go in terms of ensuring that we have a supply is building out greater integration with the rest of North America. Um, Again, nothing is foolproof, right? And the other thing I think is interesting is, it's an interesting time for battery technology because things are really advancing quickly. And, there are all kinds of smaller utilities too that have the power, so to speak, to experiment. Like the town of Berwick in Nova Scotia owns its own utility, and so they're working on battery storage. They have a lot of solar, so it also gives them more flexibility as a community. So it'll be interesting as smaller producers like that can afford to experiment a bit more, and then hopefully some of those lessons can apply to the larger system.
And
And I
certainly
love
that's something
seeing
we've seen in Summerside as well. Yeah,
in PEI as well.
in
Yeah.
Summerside. Yeah, yeah. Just on integration, part of the issue with that, I mean, as you say, Philip, there are limitations, and one of the limitations is that it's a small area. Um, if we just look at the Maritimes, uh, and we could find ourselves all in basically the same pocket of weather that's very cold with no wind blowing, and then we're all in the same boat where we're all short of electricity at the same time, and it gets a bit more difficult to share back and forth.
Yeah, I think it speaks to that pressure that's really coming to bear on the utilities in the region right now, and the governments as well, for that matter, that you do have this moment in time where there's so much transformation that's happening, and I guess so many ways that you could develop, but also your neighbors could develop, affecting your own kind of planning. And it is really kind of extraordinary to see everyone trying to navigate all of this all at once. Um, I think that just means that there's a lot to watch out for in the future. I think that's good. I'm going to thank both of you for joining me for what is a bit of a meandering discussion on power, but hopefully touches a little bit and gives people a taste of the great wealth of information that's in those stories and in that latest issue of the magazine. The issue is out now, and hopefully everyone can pick up a copy. But thank you both for being here.
Thank you,
Thank
Ashley.
you.
Learn more in the latest issue of Atlantic Business Magazine.